we know that it's more white, it's more affluent folks historically that have had the ability, have had the education, have had the disposable income to go solar. And really, how do we open market access? And that's really what I've been doing for a long time, is studying things like community renewables. We know that there's inherent barriers, whether they're lower income folks, whether they're renters. They live in places like cities that have HOA barriers or trees or zoning or other things, but they do want to do solar, right? And how do we make sure that those folks can?
Hi, welcome to the Solar for All podcast, a show focused on the intersection of clean energy, equity, justice, inclusion, and class. I'm your host, Geoff Greenfield, and all the show notes and other good information are available at our website, solarforall.show. That's spelled out SHOW. With me today is our guest, Gilbert Michaud. Oh, there I did with a D. It's Gilbert Michaud, a French pronunciation. And Gilbert's a professor. He's an assistant professor at Ohio University. He's been a friend of mine for many years and does really interesting research on clean energy and policy and economics. He originally went to the University of Southern Maine, got his degree in economics, and then got his Ph.D. in public policy from VSU. Gilbert, welcome to the show. And I'm excited to learn, what the latest observations of the industry are from your academic and policy perspective, and especially on this class, which I know means a lot to you as someone who sees clean energy not just for what it can do for our environment, but also what it can do for our culture, our economy, all the things that we're trying to grapple with as a society. Let's just jump right in. What first kind of got you excited about solar and clean energy of all the different things that someone can study in the world of economics?
Yeah, great question. And thanks for having me. It's exciting to be here. And I appreciate the invitation. It's interesting. So I went to school for economics. There's a lot of different pieces of economics, right? Labor, monetary policy, economic development, et cetera. And one of the classes that I really appreciated and enjoyed was environmental economics. And it wasn't sort of something, I didn't walk into undergrad thinking I'm going to study clean energy. But what happened in a more organic way was I got this job at a business journal, and I was working there, and I was 21, 22 years old, and they said, "Hey, Gilbert, what do you want to highlight? Do you want to work on food and beverage or manufacturing or all these different sort of industry sectors?" And I said, "How about energy and power?" And it was a very organic thing where my job was to interview, solar company CEOs, utilities that were doing projects, regulators, industry, nonprofit groups, etc. And I got to learn a lot from the business community about energy and solar and wind projects that were being built in the western part of the U.S. and offshore wind in New England, and utilities that are doing certain things, and customer pricing points, and a lot of different things that are going on in this space. And so it sort of like snowballed from there into going to graduate school for these topics. And I've been working in the space for about 10 years now.
Well, that's a great perspective, and you've probably watched it evolve and change in a lot of ways under the various administrations, that are, influencing policy, and you've probably seen a lot more of it than I have too. I'm pretty hyper focused on what's going on here in my home state of Ohio. I see a little bit about what other states are doing, but you kind of have probably gotten to look deep at some policy initiatives and policy outcomes in other parts of the country. Let's focus it on the subject at hand of justice, inclusion, where we could be doing better, where we're doing well. I think, did you have a paper on this, or were you co-author or part of a group that did a paper on this? And what was the paper?
Yeah, I've done a lot of different work on sort of energy democracy and equity and inclusion, right? And a lot of it has been focused on, community solar. And to your point, Geoff, I've lived in a lot of different states too, right? And so I've got to see what is going on in Maine and New Hampshire and other New England states, grad school in Virginia, now in Ohio. And so that's been another interesting piece of this, which is this concept of sort of new federalism, and the states have a lot of power to implement clean energy policy. And we've seen a lot of different approaches in different states through that lens as well. But at any rate, to answer your question, we just did a report entitled Policy Options to Enable an Equitable Energy Transition. And it was led by a organization called Resources for the Future and a few other EDF and a few other folks that are working on federal clean energy policy. And then a team of academics and scholars such as myself, right? And so we had folks from Ohio University, myself, we had MIT and Indiana University and Michigan and Georgia Tech, and all these folks that are studying these issues. And this was a really important report. Basically, what we were trying to better understand was sort of federally, as the U.S. undergoes this shift away from carbon-intensive energy sources and fossil fuels toward, clean energy such as wind and solar, how can we use federal policy to support workers, to support regions that are affected by this transition, right? Maybe they're lower income, maybe they're Appalachian regions, as we know in Southeast Ohio here, rural minority communities. We're trying to understand, the places and people that are affected that maybe historically have done work in coal and oil and gas. And that has been a major driver of jobs and economic activity, right? And they might be especially burdened by changes in the energy system, which are positive and can be positive, of course, from a jobs perspective and from an environmental perspective. But how do we make sure that these communities, in essence, aren't left behind, right? That's kind of the gist of what we were studying in that paper. And so we basically laid out a variety of sort of proposals. It wasn't this is what the federal government needs to do, quote unquote. But it was sort of offered a menu to Congress and other policymakers to better understand legislation that we have right now, things that we should be pushing for to make sure that we are dealing properly with abandoned mine lands or with grid infrastructure in rural communities and with workforce development initiatives around energy transitions, et cetera. So it was really important from this, how do we make sure that we are focusing on equity when it comes to energy transitions, broadly speaking?
Yeah. We'll have a link to that paper, or at least the abstract, in the show notes. And I guess there's probably a lot of different ways to interpret and walk away with useful information. Any high-level conclusions that you want to, give the Cliff Notes version to folks, or maybe let's make this less about the group and more about you. Do you have any personal takeaways or recommendations? If you could whisper in a policymaker maker's ear, policies that might help this energy transition be broader and be more of a cultural and environmental or economic transition for folks that have been on the losing end of the economy for many decades and even centuries, if you want to go back.
Yeah, great question. There was a lot of different people on the report and on the study, right? And a lot of different pieces that we were looking at, from environmental remediation to grid infrastructure and modernization, et cetera. And my kind of lead in this study was on the economic development side. And so a lot of the legislation and the pieces that I was writing about and sort of the projections in terms of jobs, et cetera, was on how can we make sure that we have better infrastructure? How can we make sure that we have better access to broadband, housing stock, which has been an issue in sort of these Appalachian and rural communities, right? And basically, how can we make sure that we have this sort of quality of life, if you will, through infrastructure, through roads and bridges, through housing, through broadband, through all of these things that we know are really important in these regions, and that have sort of gone through the boom and bust cycle for many decades at this point, right? We've saw it with coal. We're sort of in the middle of this gas boom that is inevitably going to bust at some point. And how do we make sure that we, again, from this equity perspective and through the lens of the federal government, are offering solutions to make sure that we have sort of economic and well-being that is sufficient in these regions? We've studied sort of Economic Development Administration, EDA, or ARC, Appalachian Regional Commission, these big federal agencies that are granting dollars to these communities. And I think one of the solutions that we found is that flexibility is really important. It's really hard to go through the grant process, right? Administration, you know, figuring out who's doing what, and do we have a cost share, and we have to do all these quarterly reports. And so like giving locals flexibility and ease to actually get those dollars, and then for them to implement solutions that they know are relevant to their communities because they're boots on the ground, right? Not the federal government. So that's a little bit of a broad stroke and not so much of a we need policy X. But I think like when we're talking about grant making and we're talking about the federal government intervening in these communities as it relates to equity and as it relates to energy transitions, we need to make sure that we are having a situation where there's flexibility and local knowledge and local development districts and county commissioners and all these nonprofit groups and all these folks working together that know the solutions and that know the people and know their communities and that can actually implement them and not have to deal with like federal red tape, right?
Yeah, well, I guess we're watching it play out right now. I was really pleased and excited during the presidential campaign to see how central a factor clean energy was to the talking points, and how then the candidate Biden and his team tied it in with equity and justice and inclusion. I thought it was smart politics. And now I guess we're watching to see how much of that makes its way, down into the Federal Register and then eventually, out onto the street. Are you optimistic that a lot of it's gonna get through, or do you think it's going to get bogged down in this kind of striving for consensus, or do you think it's going to get pushed through while the Democrats hold on to their one vote majority in power as of today?
Yeah, it's a window of opportunity, right? Typically, when we're studying and talking about federal policy, things do get bogged down a little bit. But I'm optimistic, and I think that when we look at things historically, right, Green New Deal, any other federal policy, even if it's unrelated to energy, you know, whatever party you're within, and you're trying to sort of push for a specific narrative, you often sort of overshoot where you want to go, and then you kind of go back to the middle a little bit, right? And so I think that I'm optimistic. I think that there's a lot of great narratives and folks that are studying this, and Biden is talking about clean energy, and this was like a complete, flip from the last president and conversations that we've had in the past, right? I feel like some of these things might be a little ambitious to go through Congress. Like we'll see where it goes, and it always comes back to money, right, and your constituents, and sort of pleasing those folks. But I feel more optimism than I have in decades, and probably my whole life, Geoff, about federal policy for clean energy. And I think that we're going to see a lot of things like grid modernization and investment and equity and inclusion. We're seeing all of these things talked about right now, and it's really about how do we implement these things, right? We know that these are important aspects. We're sort of starting to recognize, which we should have done many decades ago, but like climate change is real. We need to be doing stuff about it now. In fact, maybe even yesterday, right? And so it's more about how can we get this done, and is it feasible from a political or implementation perspective. And I think, like I said, this is a window of opportunity where we're going to see a lot more federal legislation, a lot more dollars thrown at these issues, and deservedly so.
Yeah, I'm in agreement as well, and I'm optimistic. I mean, it's we're seeing headlines like First Solar just announced a massive expansion of their manufacturing facility here in Ohio, and manufacturing is a pretty big deal in this state. Um, Everyone's looking at Joe Manchin and how much leverage he's got. You know, People were asking me, "Hey, do you think anyone's going to open a solar manufacturing plant in West Virginia?" And I tell you, a couple of years ago, I would have, thought that was a punchline to a joke, but it's actually something that might get legs. Um, on the other hand, manufacturing is largely automated and has a lot of robotics, and the efficiency of these incredibly large project or fabs, solar module manufacturing plants, doesn't really create the jobs. The jobs are largely created on the rooftops and out in the large solar farms, and then the supply chains and all the organizations at different roles. Um, I think that workforce is what I'm learning from my guests and what the census data, the solar census from the Solar Foundation shows us is it's largely male and largely white. Um, Yet we are making progress. Do you have any insight into policies or local initiatives that are trying to do both? They're trying to do clean energy and sustainability, but also trying to help do a more diverse workforce or a more welcoming workplace.
This has been a really interesting conversation here in Ohio, right? Because a lot of the big solar developers and all of the folks that are looking at state policy making as it relates to clean energy have really been focused on the economic and workforce development side of things and not so much the environmental side of things. And take that for whatever that's worth, right? But the narrative is we're supporting jobs, we're supplying tax revenues to rural communities that need them, and those are really the major drivers of these policy narratives, more so than reducing, greenhouse gas emissions or something, right? And so, a lot of the work that me and my team have been doing, frankly, has been trying to understand what these workforce transitions look like, and it's challenging. We have this like really nice narrative of, the former coal-fired power plant worker can work in the solar industry or something, and maybe they can, right? But there's some challenges. And so what we've done is we've studied what this looks like, and we've said, okay, what are the knowledge, skills, abilities, education levels of like displaced workers in the coal industry, and what might they offer to like emerging occupations within a region, right? The last thing that folks want to do and that politicians want to hear is that more folks had to leave the state because they lost their job, right? And we're going to go work somewhere else now. And so a lot of these folks have a mortgage, they have kids in school, they want to remain local, and what opportunities exist for them. And it doesn't have to necessarily even be clean energy, right? We could be talking about rural healthcare, tourism, a lot of other sectors. But if we sort of focus on energy in this discussion, we see sort of skill and wage gaps that sometimes emerge, right? We basically say, okay, if you want to work in this sector, there are jobs that are a little easier to transition to, and sometimes there are jobs that you might need to get an associate's degree or NABCEP certified or something like that. And then you have to be mindful of these wage differentials, right? Some of these jobs pay more, some of them pay less, and so that's an important part of that discussion as well. And so we've done a lot of this sort of workforce transition mapping, and one of the challenges is how does this work? Who can use these data? And really, like, who is the onus on related to these discussions, right? So, if a large investor-owned utility closes a coal-fired power plant, we have 300 displaced workers. Is it up to the utility to help with this? Is it up to the local government, county commissioners, economic development districts? Is it up to nonprofits that are working on these issues? Like, we don't really have a perfect sort of playbook for these workforce transitions, and we're sort of going through the growing pains of that right now, right? And I think we're starting to see how that looks in Ohio. I haven't seen a lot of folks that have taken it to that next level and said, hey, we want to make sure that we have diverse by age, by race, by gender, et cetera, workforce as well related to this discussion. A lot of it is sort of a reactive and not proactive situation, right? Oh no, we have 300 people that lost their jobs. What do we do? And I think that we need better planning, we need better data, we need better research, we need better conversations and stakeholder engagement to prepare for this, and to make sure that we are implementing and instituting a better and more diverse workforce in a very proactive kind of way, looking ahead. We know that energy transitions are coming. What can we do about it in the next 5, 10, 50, 20 years, right? And so I've done a little bit of work on this, trying to understand, if we should implement things like tax credits for firms that are hiring vets, or training folks from the coal industry or something like that, right? Should we have sales tax exemptions for clean energy companies that are implementing workforce training at local high schools, summer programs, et cetera? How can we push for new curriculum even at the K through 12 level through formal legislation, right? Again, how do we make sure that we are preparing and not just sort of reacting to these things? And that's sort of been a challenge, and we're working on it.
Oh, I like that tax credit for companies that are proactively reaching out and doing some of these trainings. That sounds like a smart move in a variety of ways. Gilbert, it's always so interesting to talk to you because you bring a pretty broad perspective on a lot of these issues. Solar for all. We've been talking a little bit about making it for all of the employees and workers and stakeholders on the supply side. Let's think a little bit about the demand side. It's been said, and a lot of people will attack solar and say, "Oh, it's a special, program for rich people, and it's for suburban white folks with Teslas in their driveways and solar on their roofs." Um, how do we make solar for all reach out to potential end users and broaden the folks that can benefit from clean energy on the deployment side?
Yeah, really important question. I've been working on this for a long time, and we've had these sort of local, state level net metering fights, right? Where we say, hey, this is a regressive tax. We're sort of, we know that it's more white, it's more affluent folks historically that have had the ability, have had the education, have had the disposable income to go solar. And really, how do we open market access, right? And that's really what I've been doing for a long time, is studying things like community renewables, right? We know that there's inherent barriers, whether they're lower income folks, whether they're renters. They live in places like cities that have HOA barriers or trees or zoning or other things, but they do want to do solar, right? And how do we make sure that those folks can? And so community solar is one potential solution that I've looked at for quite some time now. Some states do it better than others, of course, and some states are sort of funneling these programs through their utilities and maybe not allowing what I would call true community solar, which is a band of folks in a neighborhood can come together. They can do something like form an LLC, kind of set up a business, if you will, and have subscribers locally and do a off-site shared community solar garden, right? And so I think that let me back up for a sec. A lot of this is related to this concept of energy democracy, right? We're trying to understand how we can shift away from this sort of corporate utility-led fossil fuel economy to one that really represents better the needs and the desires of local communities. They're supporting local economies through jobs. They're reducing things like emissions, as I mentioned. And so this one exemplary way that we are sort of enhancing and seeing energy democracy and local control, like I said, is through these community solar projects, right? They're opening market access, equity, and inclusion. They're basically allowing folks to install or that couldn't install solar, rather, due to physical or financial constraints, to set up projects and be involved. And how can we make sure that we're ensuring economic and racial equity and inclusion? We're making sure that we're allowing historically marginalized or pollution burdened neighborhoods or communities to invest in these kinds of projects, right? And that's really important. I think that states should continue to adopt, low to moderate income provisions for things like community solar gardens. One of the challenges that we're seeing, however, is states that were sort of our early adopters. We've seen more commercial and industrial investors in these types of projects, and so how can we make sure that we're truly targeting the lower income folks, which is like theoretically what this type of program design model was meant to do, right? One interesting thing that I've been following, Geoff, is in New Mexico, they just passed, I think, through their Senate community solar legislation. And instead of saying we need to have, and I'm making numbers up, 30% LMI target for our community solar, a state like Minnesota has done that at the state level. And so you can meet that target through a small number of projects, but then maybe you have these, 10 megawatt projects that are all being bought up by businesses, right? And what New Mexico has done, sort of learning from, going through, looking at other states that have gone through this process, is, hey, we need to have these LMI targets at the project level. That will truly ensure that we are meeting this objective, not only comprehensively, but on a project specific basis, where we're making sure that we're having a certain percentage of our folks that are historically low income investing in these projects. And so this has been really interesting. I think community solar is a really innovative program policy design. It's only been around for 10 or 15 years. We're empowering sort of local ownership and energy solutions. We're helping enhance economic development through local installers, as you well know. We're reducing emissions, and we're sort of having a little bit more local control, which is what folks want, right? And this is not to be sort of anti-utility or anything, but like systems are changing and tastes and preferences are changing, and I think community solar is sort of this interesting middle ground that checks a lot of boxes for folks, basically.
Yeah. I actually had to stop and write down a note. Energy democracy. You hit on a bunch of different themes here, and it seems like in your career you've been focused on power and economics and how policy plays into this. A cynic could look at American history and our current governance and say we get the best laws money can buy, and that doesn't lead necessarily to change. It usually leads to concentration of power and kind of a protection of the status quo. And that's in a lot of ways kind of what we've had in our centralized, largely monopoly energy model for many years. Yet solar is just by its own distributed nature changing that. It's just with a free fuel and the ability to have a smaller investment that doesn't require, the $1 billion concentrated centralized power plant economies of scale. It's really a disruptive technology. I think it's pretty fascinating to find out how policy is adjusting to it and maybe even following it in some ways, reacting to it. And then I think you're pointing out in sometimes defensive ways. Those that have power are trying to hold on, and it's a fight. But in some places, the little guy and the little gal are winning, which is exciting. Any case studies or programs or innovative policy models that you're following that might be interesting to our listeners?
Yeah, good question. A few different things I'd probably want to touch on is, historically from this policy and sort of disruptive technology perspective, right? Like we kind of go back in history and we try to understand the origins of things like large electric utilities and sort of these institutions that we have now in 2021, right? And so, utilities we know now are sort of lobbying against distributed solar generation, and the history of this is they were set up, about 100 years ago to provide electricity to Americans, right? And they've largely sort of been these monopolistic organizations that are vertically integrated. They own all of these generation assets and the transmission and distribution infrastructure, and all the way down to the customer billing and relationships, right? And so something like distributed solar is kind of flipping that model that's been around for many decades and generations on its side, right? And that's sort of what these conversations are about. And so the utilities are still sort of pushing back on things like distributed solar, and the economist in me would say, well, that's a rational perspective. Whether their arguments are correct is a different conversation, but they're citing things like, oh, this is there's grid complications. We don't know how to meet peak demand. This reverse Robin Hood, regressive tax argument, which is challenging and probably incorrect. And so, at any rate, they are utilizing sort of their money and lobbying power to influence state policy, like you said, Geoff, and are in many ways getting what they want, right? And so we've seen things like standby or fixed charges for folks that have invested in solar, and that can be a complication in many states, and a lot of other things that are sort of putting up arbitrary barriers for folks going through this local energy democracy and inclusion and involvement kind of process, right? And so we've seen a lot of this in Ohio, and I can talk about that. But a lot of my research over the years has been, okay, what are these local, maybe even loophole programs, if you want to phrase them as such, ways that folks are getting around some of these policy barriers and these utility fights and the lobbying and the money power, right? And so I think one great example, frankly, is a local one with SOPEC, right, and their carbon fee program. And I don't know if you've talked about this on the program before or not, but this is this Southeast, and they changed their name recently to Sustainable Ohio Public Energy Council, and they're a community choice aggregation entity. Sort of set up this program that in 2018, I believe it was, they had this group of local energy stakeholders, and they developed this community-based sort of solar carbon fee model. And what they did was they said, hey, we want to collect a zero point 0.2 cents per kilowatt hour incremental fee over the standard rate, right? And what they did is they didn't have to do this, but in a very democratic fashion, they ran this through a ballot initiative locally. It passed with 76% of voters in favor of adopting that program. And the idea here was that they want to use these funds to pay for the development of behind the meter solar installations in the city of Athens, right, in the community, rather than purchasing renewable energy credits from elsewhere, wind farms in Iowa or Texas or something like that, right? And so it's really interesting. It was kind of enabled through the structures of having a CCA in Ohio, right? There's only 7 or 8 states that allow CCAs, but sort of this this electricity buyers group, sort of quasi government, quasi utility kind of organization that had a lot of local flexibility, that had a lot of local demand in a city like Athens, college town, a lot of folks that are interested in clean energy. They said, hey, we want clean energy and we want it to be local. And this is a way that they basically could collect funds. And it's garnered a lot of attention sort of, regionally and even nationally. I've given some presentations on this model. I've written a couple academic papers on this program. And we'll start to see if it diffuses to other CCAs and to other like localities that are saying like, how can we develop local innovative solutions to deploy clean energy despite policy barriers, despite some of the roadblocks that we face. And this is a really cool model that I think is certainly worth discussing and highlighting.
Yeah, and the fact that it's in action suggests that it's viable. I've got friends in Boulder, Colorado, that kind of began with a similar goal of democratizing energy and taking it control and driving it towards local clean resources. And I think that the approach that they took was to basically become their own utility, to buy their utility back and take control of the utility. And I haven't been following it lately, but basically it's been a long-term fight, and it hasn't led to the goals that they wanted. Whereas this community choice aggregation piece, with a focus on reinvesting some of this money in local projects, is it's not changing the world just yet, but it's in place. It's happening. Yeah, we're
Exactly.
proud of it. It's a neat program here. What other programs are you bumping into, or policy ideas, or even just groups of people trying to take back their power and do something for clean energy and or economic justice and or social and racial justice? Any other neat examples out there?
Yeah. So like I said, the SOPEC carbon fee model is of direct interest, right? I think that folks are trying to understand how they can leverage the sort of flexibility and democratic processes that things like rural electric cooperatives and municipal utilities offer, right? They have a little bit more flexibility from a utility structure perspective as opposed to the large investor-owned utilities. And so a lot of the really cool, innovative projects we've seen, especially when I'm thinking about something like community solar, have been on the co-op side, where they're doing projects because of the member demand and because they're membership organizations that are sort of involving. They're not just ratepayers, right? They're sort of member owners of these co-ops, and so they're involved in these meetings and these discussions and these processes. There's a co-op in Virginia called BARC Electric Co-op. BARC is an acronym for Bath Allegheny Rappahannock Co-op, I believe. They're in Southwest Virginia, Appalachia, coal country, and they like developed community solar. Gosh, it must have been 5-6 years ago at this point, maybe more. And they've had so much local demand for community solar and local solar that they've done multiple phases of their project, right? And they've gotten a lot of national attention for this, and other co-ops that are trying to think about, hey, maybe we do want to be more responsible and more responsive to our member owners, and they want local clean energy solutions. How can we do things like community solar gardens or other types of things, EVs and storage and charging stations and all of these sort of advanced energy technologies that are starting to come to scale. they're reducing in cost. They're becoming sort of more, deployed across the country. And how can these structures set up these types of solutions and projects? There's been talk about how can we do municipal solar in Cleveland, which has a municipal utility, and there's a lot of nonprofit groups on top of just the flexibility of utilities that are involved in this. Solar United Neighbors is a really good one that is doing these solar co-ops. They also have sort of this advocacy policy angle where they're trying to pitch for things like, hey, we want to pass PPA legislation. They just did that in West Virginia, which was really exciting and interesting. Other states that are looking at this, like Florida. How can we continue to evolve as we start to get into the decades of net metering, community solar, PPAs, all of these, RPS, SREC markets, all of these different policy initiatives, low interest loans and grant programs, and even sort of financial incentives. We now have so much data, right, to go back and look at what worked, what hasn't worked, what can we learn from the states that were early adopters, et cetera, and how can we sort of get to this place where we're making smarter investments and decisions based off of things we've done in the past, based off of the unique structures that we have, such as co-ops. And I think that's a really exciting sort of path forward. When I was doing community solar policy adoption interviews, Geoff, one of the really interesting things that I learned from that research was not only about subscriber compensation and program caps and all these specificities of the projects, but it was just about how do we get to a place where we can adopt policy. And it was through all of these things that I'm talking about. It was through local innovation. It was through the SOPEC CCA carbon fee program, not specifically, but like things like that. It was through folks that are doing sort of loophole programs, and it bubbles up to the state level and says, hey, if we actually pass something that would enable this at a larger scale, we'll see all of this, we'll see all these benefits emerge. We'll see all of the jobs come. We'll see all of the emissions reductions. It's sort of this bottom up approach that I think has been really exciting to see in the policy space.
Yeah, neat. Classic diffusion of innovation stuff with experimentation and trial and error, and some error and some failure, but also some successes that hopefully can be replicated. That's what it feels like, that today we're at that cusp of that transition from pushing a rock uphill, and lots of rocks really, and now we're getting to this big transition point where some of those rocks are going to get momentum and start to really make impact on the other side of that cusp. At least I hope so. You are one of the wonkiest of wonky academic policy nuts that I like to chat with, and I mean that as a compliment. It's funny. We go to these solar conferences sometimes, and no one's talking about their favorite baseball team. They're talking about policy, and they're talking about technology, and it's what's fascinating to our industry. And I think that the policy conversations are broadening. I sense that it's less about net metering and more about inclusivity and more about social and economic justice. I don't know. Are you noticing that as well? Is that in your circles that people are talking more about these parts of our industry?
I think I think yes, and I think sort of education and data points and history, and like we've progressed so much since over the past 20 years or so that we're having different conversations. We know how net metering works. We know how renewable portfolio standards work. Like, we know how some of these things are set up, and so we've taken that conversation to the next level with historical data and with sort of new agendas too, right? Where we said, okay, net metering, a 1-to-1 kilowatt hour sort of repayment mechanism. That's fine. That's simple. Are there other ways that we should be doing, value of solar and understanding all these very intricate nuances of the utilities and consumer benefits and emissions and jobs and all of these things that are really complicated, but we can quantify them, right? And maybe there's other ways that we can think about, repayment mechanisms. And I think even just current events that have pushed new agendas, and it really kind of pains me to say that it took something like George Floyd to push this equity and inclusion discussion, but it's happening everywhere. And I think that it's really exciting to see it happening in clean energy, right? It's clearly happening in sort of our criminal justice and policing systems, right? And that policy realm. We've had these conversations, frankly, over the past year or year and a half with the health pandemic and vaccines and like this equity and justice conversation around who has access to vaccinations and all of these different things and nuances related to healthcare. And now we're starting to see it sort of funnel into clean energy, right? Which we've had these conversations before, Geoff, right? Over the past decades, but they're becoming more pointed. They're becoming more aggressive, and more people are wanting to say like, how do we make sure that we're actually hitting low income neighborhoods? How do we make sure that we're having racial diversity when it comes to the solar workforce? And we're starting to have those conversations now, which is really exciting because we've had a few decades of state clean energy policy and local innovation and programs, and now we're sort of, in my mind, taking it to the next level. And I think that's like an emerging area of research as an academic and as a lot of other folks that are working in this space in terms of state policy and local innovation and utility structures and grid modernization and like new technologies that we don't even know about yet, frankly, right? Like, what is this going to look like in 30 years if you and I were having this conversation? I don't know. And I think this local democratic innovation kind of processes are super exciting. And so I'm focusing on that, and sort of a lot of other folks are moving to focus on those types of issues for their research agendas. And like I said, we don't even know what's out there and where this will all go ultimately. But right now, we need to make sure that we are, targeting and including pollution-burdened neighborhoods and folks that maybe didn't have access to solar, who couldn't work in this industry before. And so, as things deploy and develop and diffuse, I think it's all really exciting, and we're just going to continue having these conversations.
Yeah, and hopefully we'll be, patting ourselves in the back for, successful progress made. Or it's possible, I guess, with folks like you out there looking at the numbers and holding people's feet to the fire, maybe we'll be calling out folks that are more talk than walk. I think that's the danger here, is that this, might be, a trendy kind of focus right now, with a bunch of folks positioning and spinning their marketing mechanisms, but will it lead to real change, real lasting change? Um, I hope so, but I'm cautious on this.
Cautiously optimistic, right? I think that having these conversations is a good first step. And I think that sort of a key part of equity and inclusion is even having equity and inclusion through these conversations, stakeholder engagement. What's your perspective? What's your perspective? When we're doing something like setting up, value of solar studies, we want to make sure that we're including all of the different perspectives inherent within, right? We want to make sure that we're talking to the utilities. We want to make sure that we're talking to affected citizenry. We want to make sure that we are being inclusive from the get-go, and it goes all the way from how do we do things, let's start this conversation and engage with everyone and give them a voice. Let's implement policies and programs and see how it worked, and then let's evaluate those things. And if we need to make amendments, or if they didn't really achieve their objective, let's go back and make amendments and revisions to make sure that we are truly focusing on equity and inclusion. So I think I'm optimistic. I think that this is like really where this is going in the future. But I want to stress that we need to make sure that we're also including folks from the beginning, right? We don't want to have sort of secondary or affected stakeholders, which are, well, the big folks in the state capitals or in DC set up all these really great programs. They didn't really work very well. We didn't talk to any of the locals to make sure that their perspectives were being included or shared, and thus, we didn't take it as far as we could. So I think that we need to have these conversations with folks even now, if I may.
Yeah, I agree. Things might be different if we had the low income and mostly people of color folks in Lorain, Ohio, that were downstream of those smokestacks, at the policy table. And for years they were excluded, and their children are dying of asthma at a rate that's, maybe double the norm. That can't happen. I think that we're waking up, and the world is moving in a different direction. And I too am cautiously optimistic. Well, we could get into wonky policy for another hour, but it's time to kind of wind this thing down. Um, Here at the Solar for All podcast, we do the Better Together section, where our guests get to share some wisdom and insights and ideas with our podcast viewers. So the first part is the note and promote, where you've got a book, wisdom, some advice, anything that from a thought leader that you'd like to amplify. Anything to share, Gilbert?
Yeah, a couple things. I have a friend, a fellow academic. Her name is Leah Stokes at UC Santa Barbara. She wrote a book, I think it came out about a year and a half ago, called Short Circuiting Policy. And it's won awards and got a lot of national recognition, and really amazing book. There's actually a chapter in there about Ohio when the House Bill 6 stuff was going on a couple summers ago. She sent me a text and said, "What's going on in Ohio with HB 6? I'm going to halt. I'm going to talk to my editor and my publisher and halt the book production so that I include a chapter just about Ohio and state policy." And that's how sort of juicy and interesting the stuff going on in Ohio has been. And I highly recommend it for folks that are interested in sort of state policy and utilities and nonprofit groups and solar industry and all of these different discussion points and battles going on across the country. That's a great book. And I'd also want to recommend real quick the Energy Gang podcast, which I'm a huge fan of. They do a great job of renewable energy and clean tech and these energy transitions that are going on. Jigar Shah is a big name in the field, and he's now at DOE. And Catherine Hamilton is another sort of hero of mine who's on the podcast. And I got to meet her in Chicago a few years back when I was at an awards ceremony. And she's great. She's from Virginia, so we've had some connection points when I was in grad school and such. And that's a really great podcast too. So Short Circuiting Policy from a book perspective, and the Energy Gang is a great podcast folks should check out.
Super. And what an appropriate title, Short Circuiting Policy. That seems to be what the shenanigans were that was happening in Ohio for HB 6. More and more revelations coming to light these days. And of course, we love the Energy Gang. So we'll have a link to that in the show notes. A great resource in our world. Any advice or wisdom that you want to pass along?
Yeah, this sounds a bit cliche perhaps, but I think it's okay to make mistakes and learn from them, right? And what I mean by this in sort of the context of our conversation, and we're talking about clean energy research and solar, is we're always sort of learning new tools and data and approaches. We have new technologies that are going to emerge, like I said, that we don't even know about, and new policy mechanisms and innovation that are going to continue to accelerate and happen. And so when I'm doing research, mistakes are sort of inevitable, but it's about whether I can learn from those mistakes, and whether, from a policy perspective, even our governments can learn from mistakes that we've made, whether it's, this didn't really work out very well, or this didn't really target those low income folks as we had hoped or expected. It's not, well, let's just table this and not try again. It's how do we learn from that? And how do we make sure that we are thinking creatively to these major problems? We're considering new methods, and we're ultimately doing things that are creating value to all stakeholders, right? And so a cliche comment perhaps, but I think we need to make sure that we're sort of going back in time and learning from our mistakes too, moving forward, right?
Yeah, I love it. It reminds me of that. I don't know if it's apocryphal, that quote attributed to Edison about a filament that didn't work in his light bulb research. It was like, oh, great, one more filament that we're sure doesn't work, or whatever it was. But yeah, that innovation, that trial and error is critical. And I think that earlier in the pod, we were talking a little bit about that, how, the different things that people are doing at the local level, some of that stuff can really catch on and be part of the bigger amplified solution. Speaking of amplified, I like to turn up my speakers and listen to music. It gets me out of my head and helps me deal with some of the stress of living in this crazy old world of ours. We're building a great playlist here. It's the Better Together 1+1 playlist. It's on Spotify, at Apple Music, all the different streaming services. And you get to nominate two of your favorite songs and artists. We're going to start with an old favorite, or a go-to, a standard in your playlist. Who do you want to give a nomination to, Dr. Michaud?
Yeah, Good question. I'm from Maine originally. Maine has a pretty cool like rock scene. I went to undergrad in Portland, Maine, and I sort of I was a rock fan growing up, and so 311 and Incubus and some of those kinds of folks are bands that I've liked. I would probably go with Circles, which is a song by Incubus, which kind of relates to this discussion of like how things are cyclical and like we're learning from history and like things are kind of evolving, but they go in circles in some ways. And I think that's a great kind of song that I've liked for a while now.
All right, Circles from Incubus. Thank you very much. And now, what's something new that you want to throw a little effort behind?
A newer band that I've been following is called Fire from the Gods. They've been around for about a year or two, I think, sort of more popular wise anyway. And they sing a lot about sort of social injustice and some of these issues. And it's not necessarily related to clean energy specifically, but they have a song called Break the Cycle, which I really like because it's about, why are we stuck in these old ways and why, like, it's about social injustice, right? And they actually released a music video for it last summer, like a month after the George Floyd thing, and it's really powerful. It kind of gives me goosebumps. And so, "Break the Cycle" by a band that is a little newer called Fire from the Gods. It's rock music is pretty good, and I would recommend that one.
All right. Well, fire from the gods is another word for solar.
There you
So
go.
I like it. I like the connection. Well, thanks so much for being on our pod, Gilbert, and thanks for the work you do. As an academic, you're kind of pursuing, I guess, what's interesting to you and what could be published and be useful. But I know you also have a great bit of influence on that, and what you're focused on. I believe is useful to us as our energy and cultural parts of our society evolve. And so keep it up, and hopefully you'll be part of the revolution that we're all working towards bit by bit here. Um, and thanks to our sponsor, Third Sun Solar, for making this happen. And thanks to our listeners out there. If you like what you hear, please pass it along. We want to get a lot of folks signing up for this so we can spread the word. Share us with a friend. Find the show notes at solarforall.show. And if we're going to be successful in the fight against climate change, we're going to need everyone to be in that fight. And we all have to learn and grow if that's going to happen. So let's keep working together and create a world where truly we can have solar for all. Thank you again, Gilbert, and look forward to hanging out and catching up on policy matters and music and everything in between next time we see each other in real life.
Yeah, no doubt. Thanks, Geoff. I really appreciate you all having me. This has been fun.